Whether you're dating, married, or in a committed relationship, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your relationship can help you strategize and figure out how to build a relationship you've longed for. This is where the Relate Relationships Assessment comes in. It's the most comprehensive relationship assessment in the world. It's research based on the major predictors of marital stability, and it's recommended by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapists. Also, it's the one that my husband and I used when we were in premarital couples counseling. So for 20% off the assessment, go to relateinstitute.com and enter Polinsky20. Again, that's relateinstitute.com and enter the promo code Polinsky20 to get 20% off. Welcome to the Communicate and Connect podcast for military relationships with your host, Elizabeth Polinsky, a military marriage counselor. If this is your first time listening to the Communicate and Connect podcast, please take a second to go rate, review, and subscribe to make sure you get all our future episodes. We also really want to know what it is you love about our podcast, and if for some reason you're not loving it, we want to know that too, because we're committed to providing the best quality content to help you improve your relationships. This is episode 9 on common relationship problems. This is the Communicate and Connect podcast, and I am Liz Polinsky, and I'm here with my friend, Dr. Clyde Angel, and I'm really excited for him to share a lot of his experiences working with veterans and couples, and maybe I'll just let him introduce himself.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate you inviting me to come and share with you and share with your audience. So I am a retired VA chaplain. I worked in Atlanta, Georgia as a mental health chaplain. In the last 11 years of my career, I was the chief chaplain at the Indianapolis Bush VA Medical Center. Also, during that time, I worked with spiritual care and mental health. I also was a national coordinator for a program called Warrior to Soulmate, which was a program for veteran couples to work on communications, etc. And then I also did individual counseling with both PTSD, spirituality, and also working with couples individually, and particularly couples where the veteran had experienced combat trauma and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. So that has been a very rewarding last part of my career before retiring from the VA last June.
Yeah, you have told me about your career experience before, but even just hearing it again, I'm like really impressed with all of the types of different experiences that you have gotten to have. Yeah, it's really amazing. And I think something that's always stood out to me that I really loved about working at the VA was how much chaplains were integrated into mental health and how much I got to collaborate with chaplains. That was such a unique experience, I guess, job perk of getting to work at the VA.
Yeah, and I think what makes it really unique, even to the public sector, Liz, is that in the VA we really can do what I call holistic care because we have all the disciplines in one place, and each discipline can bring their part to the table. And I just think that really is a great benefit for our veterans. And I'm a veteran, so as a veteran myself, I really do appreciate the holistic care that the VA provides our veterans.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I miss that now, being in private practice. So part of how you and I know each other, since the audience doesn't know, but I used to do the Warrior to Soulmate workshops, and that's how we got connected, was by the chaplain at my VA connecting me to you, and us talking a little bit about pairs curriculum. And so you have had a lot of experience, a lot of different types of experience integrating spirituality and mental health care. And I think I think you're also a licensed professional counselor also, right?
That's correct. Uh-huh.
You really are maybe one of like the experts in integrating those two realms. What are some of the big issues that you have seen come up for couples over your years of working with them? What's kind of the big themes?
Okay, so what's really been amazing, I was a local church pastor for 27 years, and so I did couples counseling there, and then I was in private practice for 6 years before going to the VA. And it's really been the same with couples all the way across the spectrum. And if I said that there were three broad categories that always come up when I'm working with couples, it is communications, sex, and money. Not to say there's not other issues that come in like parenting and so forth. There's smaller issues that may come, but those three, when I ask couples, tell me what's going on, those three usually get mentioned. So it's been interesting that kind of, and then communications. What I really come, Liz, to really narrow it down to, it really does come down to communications. I think when couples come in for counseling, they'll bring a lot of different issues, but what I have found at the core of this really is their inability to communicate with each other.
Yeah. What do you think are some of those blocks to communication?
Well, I think one of them is, there's a concept that I learned about that really became the center of the work I did with couples and still would do with couples. And it's a concept called bonding. And bonding is a combination of emotional openness and physical closeness with another person. That's how we get bonding, and it's a biological need that we all have, just like food, water, air, and shelter. We have a need to bond, and what's interesting is we can't we can fulfill all the other biological needs: food, water, air, shelter, safety. We can supply those on our own, but we need another human being to provide that bonding.
The type of couples therapy that I'm learning and I'm trying to get certified in it right now is emotionally focused couples therapy, and it's all focused on bonding and the attachment bonds and that premise that we do actually need someone else, and we need to have that secure, safe place to turn to count on someone else to help provide for emotional needs.
And when you're talking about veterans who've experienced, again, trauma and maybe have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress syndrome, the interesting thing is you just use the word trust. And with trauma, and when I work with folks around spirituality and trauma, I say that the major or the number one spiritual wound of trauma is shattered trust. And so I think for couples where one or the other has had a significant trauma, that also gets undermined. And so, again, learning how to bond, learning to be emotionally open and physically close to each other becomes a real important piece of that communication process. And so one of the things that I like to say to couples to also break down, and going back to what you said, what are the issues, kind of set the stage for talking about issues, is I like to remind couples that they love the person, but they don't like the behavior. I can tell you my whole 40 plus years in doing this work, I've had more than one couple come in, and one or the other would say, I love him or I love her, but I'm not in love. And I would laugh. I would literally kind of just sit back and laugh. And I said, well, great, I can help you with that. Because, when you think about it, you can't make one person love another person. That's a choice. That's an internal choice. That's a decision. But when people say I'm not in love, what they're really talking about is they're not feeling the emotion of love. And so one of the things that I try to get couples to focus on is that I want them to realize that what they love the person, what they don't like is the behavior. And so it's getting couples to refocus away from, well, he's this or she's that, and focus on, okay, what specifically is the behavior that is causing the distress, and how can we address that specific behavior and ask our partners for a behavioral change.
Yeah, versus just getting critical or blaming or destroying someone's character.
Exactly.
Not, yeah, separating what you don't like that they do from who they are as a person.
Correct. And it's interesting that you mention anger, because I think that's an important piece also. And again, addressing again with veterans, I have never met a veteran who has experienced, again, combat trauma and has the diagnosis of PTSD that isn't just full of anger. And so what I developed was what I call anger resolution versus anger management. So anger management, and the way I would say it to groups particularly is I said anger management is designed to keep us out of jail. So that when we experience the emotion of anger, that we learn to control the anger so we don't do something stupid. And I often would even use maybe some Hebrew Christian scripture where it says, "Be angry and sin not." And I said, I've always read that as be angry and don't do something stupid. But if all I'm doing is helping people manage the anger, they're still walking around with the essence of anger. And so
absolutely,
I begin to work with folks and talk about, okay, how do we resolve anger? And so the process of anger resolution is really getting down to two questions. Why am I angry, and what am I feeling? And so treating anger as a secondary emotion. So what I mean by that is the primary emotion that triggers anger. We don't just sit and get angry. There's something that drives the anger, okay? So if you think about this a minute, so why am I angry? What am I feeling? So why am I angry? People can answer that quickly. I was angry because someone pulled out in front of me on my way here today, or I'm angry because I got cut off in line, or I'm angry because someone hung the phone up on me. So the why.
Yeah. In my case,
it's
I get angry because my husband doesn't do the dishes.
Okay, so that's a behavior. Well, I'm angry because he didn't do the dishes. That's a behavior. So that triggers the anger. But then where I have to really work with folks is to say, okay, you're angry because your husband doesn't wash the dishes. What are you feeling? So, in other words, what's the feeling that you have that's underneath the anger itself? Have you ever thought about that?
Yes, yeah. And I think I use this example of the dishes because it's maybe comical between my husband and I. It comes up frequently, but when he doesn't do the dishes, I end up feeling like he doesn't care.
Okay, right. So you feel hurt or feel that he doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about your needs or concerns or so forth. And so if we can get underneath, now I can communicate. If I just say, well, I'm angry because you didn't wash the dishes, that creates conflict and there's no resolution. But if I can sit down with my partner and say, when you don't wash the dishes, I feel like, now we're back to feeling, I feel like you don't care about me. So you see the difference there. And so with angers, what we have to do is we have to figure out what the emotion is driving it. And then
the emotion underneath the anger.
And so it may be fear, or it may be, and with veterans, a lot of times it's betrayal or disrespect. And then what I have them do and this is all part of the resolution, is then to go back and I'll say, when's the earliest time you felt betrayed? Or when's the earliest time you felt disrespected? And Liz, it's really amazing. Almost every person I take through this exercise will go back to early childhood. Tell me your first memory, far back as you can remember. I've had people, I even had a therapist who worked with me one time, was sitting in a group, and he says, second grade. And I looked over at him and I said, share more. And he shared a very vivid experience with his second grade teacher where he felt disrespected. And so what I do is I get people to go, okay, that's the first time that you really had a deep emotion that you tied to anger around disrespect. Now let's go forward. What's the next event in your life where you felt significantly disrespected? So what you're helping people do is identify events where they've been wounded. And so the real work comes later in the forgiveness, because if we can mark those major wounds in our life, they become the fertile ground for us to go back and work on forgiving those moments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if I were to kind of summarize, we're talking about finding the emotion that's underneath the anger and changing the conversation to where that's what we're talking about, the feelings underneath the anger, and not so much like in the case of the dishes, the conversation is no longer about the dishes. It's about feelings of betrayal or the deeper emotions.
Right. Or not caring.
Mm-hmm.
So your partner may not realize the feelings that you have because he doesn't wash the dishes. But once he hears how it makes you feel and what it may connect to in your life, right?
Yes, the other times that came up for me.
Right. He may be more motivated then to hear that request, and he may react differently when it comes the next time to wash the dishes, because he's got a different, deeper understanding.
That's the hope for sure.
See, that's the bonding. That's the emotional open. So if one person is going to be emotionally open, the other person has to be willing to listen with empathy, listen to really understand. And I know I'm moving to kind of a little different subject, but hopefully all this ties back in.
That's okay.
Listening is the key to communications. Most of us are pretty good talkers, and the majority of us are not very good listeners. And particularly when in a intimate relationship where a lot of emotion can be tied in, often when we begin to get charged up and we start having feelings of being irritated or upset or angry, we get defensive, and so instead of listening, we're working on our response rather than really listening. So a real good exercise that I have couples do is I will have one couple just state what the issue is and talk about their issue and their feelings around that issue, while the other person listening simply listens and repeats what they're hearing. And that's amazing when someone is all they're doing is repeating what the other person's saying. They begin to really listen. And if they do that with empathy, really understand what's going on with their partner, I've watched couples just totally change in the moment in how they begin to react with each other.
Yeah, because it's so validating. If somebody can repeat back to me and confirm that they understood, that they heard what I said and understood it, and that it makes sense to them, that's such a great feeling.
And what? Yeah, I have different sayings that I've used, I guess, for years. People that know me, but one of the great wounds of life is feeling unheard, the feeling of not being heard.
Yeah, I can really understand that. That hits home. Like I feel that as you say that right now.
Yeah, and that can start in childhood. The parent that's too busy to listen, or just says, "Do what I say." I don't want to talk about it. Just do what I tell you to do. Well, when a parent makes that kind of response to a child, basically they're saying, "Whatever you're saying, I'm not interested in."
Yeah, which I think goes right back to what you said just a little bit earlier in your anger resolution model. You have people go back and see like those first early childhood times where they had that hurt, where they felt, in this case, really not understood. And it's so fascinating to me how those wounds, they continue on into adulthood. And then with romantic partners, they're like minefields. Like when it's easy to accidentally step on that raw spot in your partner because it's been hurting, because it's been such a deep wound for so long.
Right. And the interesting, we all come into relationships with our baggage. Uh, we all do, because we all have baggage, right?
Yes.
From childhood, from other relationships, not just intimate relationships, but friendships and colleagues and peers. I mean, we all just have our baggage and the things that we internally have reacted to over time. So, and I think probably another big thing when, we've talked about bonding, we've talked about, learning to listen, talked about anger. I think another really important piece, and again, this is whether whatever the subject that the couple is struggling with, whatever the conflict may be, these are the bases that help them begin the good communication. And that next thing would be forgiveness.
Yeah, I was really hoping you were going to talk about that because I do know a psychologist who has done a lot of research on forgiveness, but generally for me, I kind of put forgiveness in the realm of like a spiritual leader would
Right.
be able to comment on that way more than I feel like I could as a therapist, because I guess it feels to me like a spiritual undertaking.
And I think that that's true. And there's a lot of people who would tie that back to whatever spiritual belief system that they have, because at least the major religions all contain a large concept around around the issue of forgiveness, whether it be Judeo or whether it be Christian or whether it be Islamic. All of them speak very center of their belief system, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is centered around forgiveness. And even if you take that out of it and just think of it from the concept of spirituality, and spirituality, the stack pole of spirituality is purpose and meaning. We all have that within us, that sense of purpose, meaning. Why am I here? What is it all about? So even going from that standpoint, with forgiveness, we've gotten a lot of mixed messages through the years. And have you ever heard the old saying, forgive and forget?
Yes, but that never made sense to me
Okay.
because I don't know how I'm supposed to forget something.
It's impossible. That's the biggest load of something that somebody floated down. I don't know where they got forgive and forget. So one of the examples I use is we don't forget our significant physical wounds. If we were sitting in a room together right now, I'd point to my head and say, this was a scar when I was 6 years old in Alaska, and here's another one. Here's a scar that I got in Alaska. Here's another one that I got in California, and back here's bicycle wrecks in Tennessee, and here's 3 scars that I've had surgery on my back, and here's a big scar on my leg where I had an ACL surgery. Why do I remember
Yeah.
all of those scars? Because they all had some level of pain. Now, none of them hurt me now. There's no pain with any of the scars, but I remember them. And it is the same way with emotional and spiritual wounding. We remember what we feel. So we've got, it's not a matter of forgiving, it's a matter of making peace with the past. One of the best definition of love I actually found in a scripture that a lot of people are familiar with, especially with weddings and stuff. It's the 13th chapter of First Corinthians, and it's many know it as the love chapter, right? Love.
Is it the love is patient?
Love is patient. Love is kind. Love. And so in the NIV version of that, it says this. It gets down to a point where it says, love keeps no record of wrongs. Now, what that means is not that you don't remember. What that means is that you don't hold it against the person. So forgiveness is very much the glue of a relationship, because if I'm keeping a tally of all the things that you've done, then I'm keeping a record. And true love doesn't keep a record.
I see that so often with the couples that I've been working with recently, is a lot of times they can come in and then they start listing off all of the things their partner has done wrong. And so that tells me, based on what you're saying, they haven't made peace with it yet.
Right. And then the other real piece of forgiveness is self-forgiveness. And people really struggle with that one. and
With making peace.
making peace with yourself or just forgiving yourself. Who hasn't made the bad choice in life? I mean, we all look back and go, well, I wished I'd have done this instead of that. Well, what we're talking about is choice, right? I chose to do this instead of doing that, or I ignored this and I just did that. And so we all have places that we also have to forgive ourselves. So the process of forgiveness is kind of three steps that I when I was working with veterans and non-veterans too. Is the first thing that we have to do is mark the day and the time that you are choosing to forgive, whether it's yourself, whether it's someone else, whether it's an event, whether it's the government, etc. Whatever, it doesn't make any difference. But forgiveness is a decision. It's intentional. So Joe Smith did this to me 30 years ago. But today, August the 6th, 2020, I'm going to forgive this. And I mark it down. The reason I encourage people to mark it down is that when the feeling and memory occurs in the future, you can remind yourself that you already went through the act of forgiveness for that event.
Yeah, sort of reminding yourself that you're forgiving it.
Exactly. Exactly. So holding on to anger and forgiveness and anger really go together. So holding on to anger is like drinking poison, hoping the other person dies. It just hurts us.
Yeah, and every time I've ever wanted it to hurt someone else, I always feel like it hurt me more.
Oh, absolutely it does, Liz. And so when that memory comes back, if you mark that day and time, you say, and that memory comes back up, then you can just pause and you can go, no, on August the 6th, 2020, I forgave that. And I'm not going to hold on to that. I've let that go. So you can just remind yourself so that and what I find and I found it in my own personal life, but I've also found it in working with others, that over a period of time, it does fade. It does lessen. That when the memory comes back, it comes back with less emotion. Now, if the memory or the event continues to elicit angry feelings, then you may need to reinvestigate and go deeper because there may be something else hooked to that. One of the great examples that I have of that is having dealt with women who have experienced their father committing sexual acts against them. I can remember on several occasions that maybe the person, she came to a point where she said, you know what, I forgive my father, but I'm still angry. And it is really funny because as we explore that, we go back to the event and we begin to explore and say, well, who else would you have been angry at in that moment besides your father for what he did? And you wouldn't believe how many times, Liz, they would say, well, you know, I was really angry that my mother didn't protect me, or she didn't stand up, or she didn't believe me. And often they won't confront the other parent because that's all they got left. You know what I'm saying? So they've distanced themselves from the one parent, so they've got the other parent. And so it's like that anger got covered up, right? Because the focus was toward the perpetrator. But once they forgave the perpetrator, then what rose up was the next person in that moment that they either maybe felt betrayed by. You know, mom wasn't there. You know, she didn't protect me, and so I felt betrayed.
Yeah, to the two other parts of forgiveness. So the first part is writing it down, the date that you choose to forgive. But you said there were three parts.
So the second part is that when the feeling reoccurs, that you can go back and remember.
Okay.
And then the third part is if the memory continues, then go back to the event itself and say, okay, I've forgiven this person. What else might I still be angry about around this event? Was there something else? Was there another feeling? Was there another person? You know, what else have I really dug as deep as I need to dig around that specific event?
Have I chosen to forgive all the different wounds that happened around that event?
Correct.
And all the different players.
Right.
Okay. So we've been talking about forgiveness, and I know that you have done a lot of work with moral injury, which I think might be related to forgiveness of self. But for other people who maybe haven't heard of this term before, could you talk a little bit about what moral injury is and how it relates to some of the concepts we've been talking about today?
Sure. So when you talk about moral, or I call it spiritual injury, and so the real injury comes around. I believe that part of who we are, the biopsychosocial, spiritual. We have each of these components that make us up as human beings, and we don't question our physical self. We know that we have a mental capacity. We can talk and think. We're social beings. No one crawled out from under a rock. We're all born into a community of family. Now, how we live out our sense of being social, I can be a very gregarious person that goes and likes to be with people all the time, except for in a pandemic.
Yeah.
Or I can live on a mountain and only come down for supplies twice a year. But I'm still a social person. That's how I've chose to live out my sense of being social. So I think the same thing is spiritual. We all have a spiritual component, whether I'm a believer and I believe in God or whether I'm an atheist or an agnostic. It doesn't make any difference. We still have that spiritual component, which I talked about a little bit earlier, is meaning and purpose. Why am I here? What is it all about? That's one aspect of spirituality. The other aspect of spirituality is then, how do I connect? How do I connect to my own sense of self? How do I connect to others around me? How do I connect to the world as a whole? So, meaning, purpose, and connection. So, our spiritual formation begins in childhood. We start getting moral codes and beliefs from our parents at a very early age. Then we go off to school and we begin to get that from teachers and our peers. And then when we hit that kind of what I call the magical age, where we move from pre-adolescence to adolescence, we move from concrete thinking to abstract thinking. And that's when it really hits in gear. So we start making our own spiritual beliefs. Some things we may, if we were raised in a religious family, we may take some of that with us. Again, we start interacting with friends and colleagues. We may start listening to the news and different events. And so all of this creates what I would call our spiritual formation. And with trauma, what happens is that the trauma shatters that spiritual formation. And again, what I said earlier was the signature wound is that trust. But also what there is a woundedness. So whatever, let's say an event happens, someone does something in a combat zone, and then they label themselves. I was a coward or I was a murderer. Whatever label, they put the label on it. That's the first level of spiritual wounding. Then the next level is, let's say they share it with someone, and the person they share with has this response of like, oh, I can't believe you did that, or, how do you deal with that? Well, that's the second level, because that reinforces the shame and the guilt. The third level of wounding, then it goes from I think I'm bad to, or I feel bad, to I think I'm bad, which is the third level. I think maybe I am a murderer. I think I am a coward, or I think whatever that is. Then it moves to that fourth level of wounding. And it's a slight shift. And it shifts where I feel and I think to I am. And I am is the core of who we are. I am a coward. I am a murderer. I'm lost. I can't be connected to anything, myself or God or anything else. So that's where self-forgiveness really begins to play the role. And again, I do come from this, I come from a spiritual background. I do believe in God. And so one of the things of self-forgiveness that I tell people is, I use the example because most of our veterans have children. And I'll ask them the question, what could your child do that you would say, I don't forgive you, I don't love you anymore? And you know what the response is?
I'm hoping that it's nothing.
Nothing. I think I've had one veteran who brought up something silly. But yeah, it's always, well, nothing, chaplain. And I said, and we as humans don't even begin to understand love. God is love. And so if God can forgive, who are we not to forgive ourselves? If God has forgiven us, then who are we not to forgive ourselves? And often where veterans particularly struggle with self-forgiveness is they've never shared the story. I can't tell you the number of veterans, and I mean hundreds, over the years that came in my office, sat down, closed the door, and said to me, even when I was in private practice, said to me, Chaplain or Clyde, I've never ever told anybody this. And we're talking about, Vietnam veterans that have, 30, 40 years have held on to this story that they've never told anyone. But they've listened to that self-talk, to that place that I am less than. And so the lifeblood of post-traumatic stress is avoidance. So what they've done is they've avoided this particular wound. And when they can finally trust someone enough to share that woundedness and begin to break it down and talk about it, then that becomes the recovery. And that's really what it becomes, a recovery. But I think that's not just true with trauma and veterans. I think that's true even when we were talking about forgiveness earlier, Liz. I think that's true of the woundedness that we have all through life, and particularly if it's around a specific feeling, that we've wrapped years of anger around that feeling. And when that feeling gets hooked, then we have this explosive reaction, right? And if it was around disrespect, you could do something that's just mildly disrespectful, and all of a sudden I may see this explosion and go, where'd that come from, right? It's because we've tied all of this anger around that particular feeling.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. I'm so glad that you are here talking about this. It's making me think of, I do acceptance and commitment therapy mostly when I work with individuals, and a lot of it is about what type of person do I want to be? What are my core values that I want to stand for in life? And so what I think I'm hearing you say is that they maybe had core values like I'm kind, or I'm caring, or I'm courageous, or I'm loyal, and then they do something either in the military in combat, or something is done to them, and they start thinking, I'm no longer that person. Now I am something less than. I'm bad. I'm not consistent with who I thought I was. And so they have to...
There's a conflict. Mm-hmm. There's a conflict between what happened and their values. That's the spiritual wound.
Yeah. And I'm imagining that could happen in couple relationships too. Like I'm thinking about sometimes one partner can be very critical and blaming, and the other partner internalizes that and starts thinking like, I'm not good enough. Either I'm not a good enough partner, or what I say doesn't matter. I don't matter type of thing.
Or the other thing to think about is sometimes when one person reacts, they may hook another person. The other person's wounded.
Yeah.
Okay. So one person gets upset about something their partner did and they yell. And so it's in that yelling that the other partner says, people who yell at me don't love me.
Oh, yeah.
And so it triggers event for them. So they get hooked up in this kind of circle of each other triggering. A couple of things I'd say as we end, two things that I think that is important. One, to veterans and their significant other, is I've had often significant others come to me and say, Chaplain, if he or she would just tell me what's going on, I think we could work through some things. And my response to them is always, if he or she knew what was going on, they would probably be more than happy to share with you. That the problem with trauma is the person's trying to figure it out themselves. They're trying to come to their own sense of healing. And they can't explain, or they're afraid to share because they don't know how the other person's going to react, or they're carrying this guilt and shame they haven't worked through. And when I say that to couples, I can just see them an instant change, like, oh, so he or she isn't holding back because of me; it's because of their own struggle.
Yeah.
And that just makes a huge difference. The other thing I want to say is I did this marriage and family work specifically around Warrior Soulmate for about 10 years in the VA. And I would often say when I was working with couples in group, when we would hold one of these retreats, is I said, what I keep finding out is that each time I do these retreats, it reminds me of all these different aspects of listening and listening with empathy and looking at the behavior and not the person, all this stuff. And I said, what I really found out is in my relationship, the person I have to work on the most is myself.
Yeah, you're speaking the truth right now. Both of those points.
Because we all want to blame. Blame is so natural. I mean, it's the beginning of humanity, is one blame the other, right? And we haven't stopped. When something happens, we want to blame someone else or blame God, as I would say. It's when we take personal responsibility. And probably the hardest work we do in couples work is the work we do internally with ourselves, whether that's dealing with guilt or shame or dealing with our understanding our anger and resolving it, coming to places of forgiveness. That's that self-work. But then when we can take the self-work and couple it with learning that bonding, learning to be emotionally open and physically close, learning to listen with empathy. When we put all of that together, that's when the relationship, the bonding begins to occur, and we begin to experience the intimacy that we all long in relationships.
Yeah, and that is something that's really special and I think unique with couples therapy. Individual therapy can be so powerful, but I would say when both couples are able to heal those parts in themselves and then find a way to reconnect together, it's for me personally, I think it's one of the most beautiful things to watch.
It's powerful. I agree. It's amazing to watch those craters of valleys that have occurred between couples, to watch those come back together and to see that couple. I've sat and watched it in the retreats, Liz. I've watched couples who were sitting 2 feet apart from each other in the middle of a retreat. All of a sudden they're holding hands and putting their arms around each other. And just you can almost see the healing begin in place. And that's pretty exciting to watch that. So whether it's individually in the couples in a counseling room, or nowadays it's through Zoom and other video connections, which I've done counseling. I've done couples counseling through video. It works. So I encourage couples, seek out if you're not getting to where you want to, you're not finding the happiness and the love that you desire and want in your relationship, reach out to someone. There's a lot of folks out here who have a lot of experience, a lot of talent, and a lot of caring and compassion to help couples find healing and hope and to be able to move forward.
Yeah, well, I think we are probably out of time now, but thank you so much, Clyde, for being on this podcast. I have really enjoyed our conversation and learning from all of your experience. So thank you so much.
Well, Liz, thank you for allowing me to come and to just share, and thanks to all of those who are listening. And I hope that maybe something that we've shared here today creates an ember or touches a place in their lives that brings healing.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, please take a second to go rate, review, and subscribe so you get all of our future episodes. Make sure to check out the show notes to sign up for our free 10-week relationship email course. This email course is really designed for people who are maybe having trouble with communication or connection in their relationship, and helping them develop some quick wins right away to start improving it. While I am a therapist, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not considered therapy. And it should also not be a replacement for therapy. If you think you need a professional of any kind, you should definitely go find one. Until next time.